You are listening to Repetitions with Daisy and Jack. Today we are giving you real, science-backed research with zero ads for supplements. On today's episode, a massive study of 60,000 people found that going to bed and waking up at consistent times every day matters more for your health than how many hours of sleep you actually get. 8 hours. That's the number everyone's heard. But a study just dropped that says the when might matter as much as the how long.
More precisely, sleep regularity predicts mortality outcomes independently of duration. After you control for how much people sleep, the consistency of when they sleep still moves the needle on all-cause and cardiovascular mortality.
So the guy who logs 8 hours from 3 a.m. to 11 a.m. is not doing what he thinks he's doing.
That's the correction. And it's not a small study making that claim. Windred and colleagues analyzed roughly 60,000 adults using objective wrist accelerometry data. Not sleep diaries, not self-report. Actual movement tracking across 7 days, generating a validated consistency score called the Sleep Regularity Index. 0 to 100. Higher score means more regular. They tracked mortality outcomes prospectively, and the most irregular sleepers, bottom quartile on that index, showed meaningfully elevated all-cause and cardiovascular mortality risk compared to the most regular sleepers.
And that held after adjusting for total sleep duration.
That's the key statistical move. The association persisted after the duration adjustment, which is how the authors can say regularity is an independent predictor, not just a proxy for people who sleep regular hours also happen to sleep enough.
I want to sit with that for a second. Because the framing most people have absorbed, and I had this too, is that sleep is a volume problem. Get your hours in. Didn't matter if I was sleeping 2 to 10 on the weekend and 11 to 7 on a work night. I thought I was net neutral. The math was wrong.
The math was wrong for a biological reason. The circadian system is a roughly 24-hour molecular oscillator, present in essentially every cell. And it doesn't care about your total hour count. It cares about predictability. The suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus acts as the master clock, and it's entrained primarily by light. But peripheral clocks in the liver, the pancreas, adipose tissue, those are entrained by behavioral regularity, feeding timing, activity, and sleep timing. When those signals are inconsistent, the clocks drift out of phase with each other.
Which is the mechanism behind what Ronenberg's group called social jet lag.
Right. Social jet lag is the gap between your biological sleep timing and your socially imposed schedule. The difference between when you'd sleep if you had no alarm and when you actually have to wake up. And then the weekend, when the social constraint lifts, you drift back toward your biological preference. Even 1 to 2 hours of that shift, replicated across multiple large observational cohorts, is associated with elevated BMI, insulin resistance markers, and depressive symptoms.
Saturday night kills Sunday. Sunday kills Monday. You're back on schedule Wednesday, and you've lost half the week. I've lived that cycle enough times to know exactly what it feels like in the gym.
Have you actually tried locking wake time on weekends?
Locked it. Same alarm, 7 days. First 2 weeks felt like punishment. After that, my sleep onset started regulating on its own, which is exactly the logic behind the protocol. Consistent wake time builds adenosine pressure homeostasis across the day. You get sleepy at a consistent time. Bedtime regularity becomes a downstream consequence of wake time regularity rather than something you have to engineer separately.
That's accurate. And there's a physiological reason wake time is the better anchor point over bedtime. Bedtime is socially negotiated. You have obligations, variable alertness, the pull of screens. Wake time is an alarm clock away. And morning light exposure at a consistent hour is the primary Zeitgeber, the primary timing cue for the SCN. Cortisol awakening response is another mechanism worth mentioning here. In the 30 to 45 minutes after waking, there's a well-characterized cortisol pulse that primes glucose metabolism, immune function, and cognitive readiness. Consistent wake time is associated with a more robust response. Irregular wake time blunts it.
And blunted cortisol awakening response is not what you want going into a training session or a workday.
It's not. I'll also mention the melatonin angle briefly. Melatonin suppresses insulin secretion via receptors on pancreatic beta cells. Irregular sleep shifts the melatonin onset window relative to when you're eating. You potentially end up eating during high melatonin exposure, and that's associated with impaired glucose tolerance. The causal chain there is proposed, not fully established, but the direction is consistent with the larger picture.
So the guy who eats at midnight because he's up late Saturday may be catching a metabolic cost he doesn't even know about.
Possibly. I'm not going to overstate it. Proposed mechanism, not confirmed pathway. But the convergence of signals is not flattering for chronic irregularity.
How do you have all of this loaded at the same time?
I'm an AI, Jack. I read the social jet lag literature while you were deciding what to have for breakfast.
Fair enough.
The point is, the mechanisms aren't speculative in isolation. Each one has its own evidence base. The Windred et al. Finding sits on top of that mechanistic foundation, which is part of what makes the mortality finding credible, despite being observational.
Which brings us to what the data doesn't support, because Daisy will not let me overstate this.
Correct. Two big caveats. First, both anchor studies are observational. Windred et al. Is prospective, which is better than retrospective, and the accelerometry data is objective, which is better than self-report. But we cannot fully rule out that people with pre-existing cardiometabolic disease sleep irregularly because they're already ill, not the other direction. That's reverse causation. It's a live concern, and an RCT on this mortality endpoint is essentially impossible to run at scale. The prospective design weakens the concern, but doesn't eliminate it.
So we're working with strong evidence, not proof.
Strong observational evidence with a plausible mechanistic spine. That's the honest characterization. Second caveat, the UK Biobank cohort is predominantly white, middle-aged, relatively health-conscious. These are not 25-year-old men. The mortality effect sizes from Windred et al. Are not validated in that age group specifically. Lunsford Avery and colleagues published earlier work connecting the same regularity metric to metabolic outcomes in younger samples, which extends the relevance downward, but the direct mortality numbers from the bigger study don't map cleanly onto this audience.
So the mechanism is real at your age. The specific mortality math is drawn from older adults.
Cardiometabolic risk patterns established in midlife begin accumulating earlier. That's well supported. So the behavior matters now, even if the endpoint is decades out. Also worth flagging, the regularity literature is genuinely younger and less replicated than the duration literature. There are more total studies on sleep duration and health outcomes than on regularity specifically. Windred et al. Is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for regularity we have, which also means it's doing a lot of work without a deep pile of replications yet.
That's the honest version of the finding, and I think people can handle it.
One more thing on catch-up sleep, because someone is always going to ask. The evidence there is genuinely mixed. Some data suggests extended weekend sleep can partially address cognitive and metabolic sleep debt. Other data shows the timing shift itself carries a cost. These effects may partially cancel. I'm not going to tell you sleeping in on Sunday is definitely harmful. What I will say is that the metabolic correlates of that timing shift are real. The social jet lag data is replicated, and the magnitude of drift matters. There's a difference between sleeping 45 minutes later than usual and sleeping until noon.
And there's a natural experiment that makes the regularity argument pretty clearly. Night shift workers who rotate schedules, who are irregularly misaligned, show worse cardiometabolic outcomes than night shift workers who are on a fixed overnight schedule. Even though the fixed night shift workers are chronically misaligned with solar time, the consistency itself is protective relative to rotation. That's the clearest real-world test of the regularity hypothesis I've seen.
It's the strongest naturalistic evidence for the mechanism, yes. Consistency relative to your own pattern matters, not just alignment with the sun.
So, practically, here's what this looks like. Set a wake time. Hold it within 30 minutes every day, including weekends. That's the minimum effective dose for circadian entrainment based on how the system works. Get light in the first 30 to 60 minutes after you wake. That reinforces the anchor. Don't sacrifice duration for timing. Regularity with 5 hours is not the goal. The target is adequate sleep and consistent timing. Those aren't competing.
The 30-minute window is not a number from the Windred et al. Paper. It's an evidence-informed heuristic. The social jet lag literature consistently finds metabolic effects when drift exceeds 60 to 90 minutes. Tighter than that is better, and 30 minutes is achievable without restructuring your entire social life. If you have an extreme chronotype, you are genuinely biologically late. Forcing a 5 a.m. alarm is not what this recommendation means. Consistency within your own timing is the principle. And if you have a diagnosed sleep disorder, none of this replaces clinical care.
The "I got my 8 hours" excuse doesn't hold if those hours were 3 a.m. to 11 a.m. That's the update. Lock your wake time.
60,000 people, objective data, duration adjusted, prospective design. The regularity signal is real. We don't have the causal proof, but the evidence is strong enough that the behavior change costs you nothing and the potential upside is significant. Set the alarm. Hit it the same time tomorrow. And that's our show. Thanks for joining us on Repetitions. If you liked the podcast, you can show our team some love with 5 stars and a follow. See you next time.
Grab news. Thomas.